Welcome to Energize and Revitalize with Dr. Amy. I'm Dr. Amy Coopersmith, and this show is about empowering you to live a radiant, healthy, and balanced life. I'm very excited to introduce my first guest, Dr. Darren Peterson. Dr. Peterson is a board-certified bariatric surgeon. He started his career as a mechanical engineer and later received a master's degree in biology and chemistry. From there, he attended medical school at the Texas Tech Health Sciences Center with a general surgery residency at the University of Florida in Jacksonville. He is married to Candy Peterson, and together they own and operate Fit Body Boot Camp. The Petersons have 3 boys and live in Flagler Beach. In addition to being the founder of Florida Coast Weight Loss Center, Dr. Peterson is also the medical director for Amethyst Wellness. Welcome, Dr. Peterson, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So you're my very first guest on the show, and I chose you because we have a history that goes way back. So would you like to tell our listeners and our viewers about how we met?
Sure. We both had a common trainer, James and Jenny, down at J&J Fitness across the bridge. And I think you started working out with my wife first.
Yes.
Got in the running groups and got to know each other through that. And then you and I met many, many years ago working out with James. So have a exercise history that goes way back.
Yeah, and we collaborated together on patients way back in the day. And then your journey took you away from Palm Coast temporarily, where you discovered bariatric surgery.
It did.
How did that evolve?
So I was working here at what was then Florida Hospital Flagler. It's now Advent here in Flagler. And I had 3 young boys and was working all the time and wasn't seeing my boys. I would leave before they were up and get home after they were already in bed. And one day I looked at my wife and said, I can't do this anymore. So had an opportunity to move back to Texas and became an associate professor for Texas Tech University and thought I was going to love teaching. Lasted a couple of years and realized that students these days are a little bit different than what I remember.
Yes.
So wound up back in the private sector and started working with a couple of bariatric surgeons. When was that? Probably 2016 or so. And fell in love with it. It was an aspect that at the time I didn't know much about. I had been brought up in the traditional way of thinking about weight loss, the old calorie in, calorie out, and that it was really just a matter of portion control. And if people weren't losing weight, that they just didn't have the willpower. And so I was really pretty negative about the whole bariatric world until I started discovering that there's a lot more to the physiology than I understood and was even taught. And the more that I began to understand it, I began to simultaneously develop a passion for these people that were really struggling with their weight. And so did that for several years and then had the opportunity to move back and start the Florida Coast Weight Loss Center here in town. And we serve patients from literally all over the Southeast.
Wonderful. And I think your passion for helping people in their weight loss journey, that's how our professional lives cross paths again, because that's one of the founding principles at Amethyst Wellness was helping people to become healthier in one way by achieving a healthier weight. So we have, an obesity epidemic here in this country. Why do you think that is?
Oh, gosh, it's actually many factors, and it truly is an epidemic. When you look at the numbers and the curves and how they have just continued to escalate out of control over the last 50 years, you have to begin to think that in large part, it has to do with dietary concerns. Again, I think we've placed the onus of responsibility on the patient's shoulders and made them feel like, well, you're just eating too much and you're just not exercising. And while that is true in part, there's a much larger story. And I think the way that our nutrition has changed plays a huge role in what we now see as this obesity epidemic. Before there was McDonald's on every corner. Right. We live such a fast-paced life that we place very little emphasis on the importance of nutrition. And so we just fill our bodies with things that have created this state.
Right. You mentioned earlier that you've kind of moved away from a calories in, calories out model. What do you mean by that?
So again, we believed for a long time that the way that our bodies responded was exactly the way that a mechanical system responded. So the energy balance model of weight loss basically follows along the first law of thermodynamics, which basically says that energy can't be created or destroyed. That if you have energy in a system and you want to decrease the energy in the system, you either give it less or you extract more. Well, that works great for a mechanical system, but our biologic systems are very, very different, and they really don't behave in that way. And so about a decade ago, a group of physicians sat down and they started asking the question of, after all these years of preaching calories in, calories out, why are we no better off and in fact getting worse? So they wiped the slate clean and began to look at physiology again. And as they did so, they began to discover that it really wasn't about calories. It was really about the hormonal response to those calories. And so they started down a pathway of trying to investigate what are all the hormones that are involved in regulating our response to calories.
Right. So we talked in private about insulin and the role of insulin in fat storage. So is that one of the main hormones in the system?
It really is. People now have gotten accustomed to talking about hormones, and they really look towards ghrelin and leptin. They love talking about ghrelin and leptin. Ghrelin being the hunger hormone, leptin being the satiety or the fullness hormone. But when you stop there, that really takes all of the weight right back to calories. It's basically saying, well, if I'm not as hungry, then I won't consume as much. That's going to cause me to decrease my calorie intake. That's how I'm going to lose weight. But what we now understand is it's all the other hormones that are working in a very, very complex fashion that eventually control the downstream hormone, insulin. And insulin is really what regulates whether our body stores fat or not. And so controlling the insulin response is really what we're after. And that's a very complicated thing. It's not as easy as just eat less.
Right. So how does a person control the insulin response?
So there's many different factors. We've certainly found that for some patients that surgery can actually do that. And we can talk in a minute about how surgical procedures can actually modify hormonal responses. But nutrition absolutely changes that. Our activity and exercise can also modify hormonal responses, and our organ system optimization that can control some of that. And then other things like stress and sleep and those types of things.
That's a huge issue for our listeners, I think.
In our modern day life, again, our very quick-paced life, we tend to just shove our sleep under the rug and say, well, I just get the sleep that I need. Or we shove our stress levels under the rug and, well, I just live with a lot of stress. But we're ignoring the very detrimental hormonal response that can come from those types of issues.
Right. And how do our dietary choices affect our hormonal response?
They affect it to a great degree. And it's one of the things that we spend lots and lots of time concentrating on. As a bariatric practice, we really try to help people understand that while surgery can be a great tool to helping them achieve their goals, it is just one of many tools. I use the example all the time of a builder that goes to a job site to build a house, and he shows up, opens his toolbox, and the only tool in his toolbox is a hammer. How successful do you think that guy's going to be building the house?
Right.
Obviously not very. Well, our bodies are the same way. And what most people do when it comes to their weight loss is they say, oh, well, I'm going to use this diet or that diet or this exercise or this pill or this shot or whatever it might be. And they're relying on a single tool to change our biologic systems. Well, if you can't build a house with a single tool, how do you think you're going to change something as complex as our physiology with a single tool?
Right.
You can't. So nutrition is critically important in beginning to understand how the various macronutrients, your proteins, your carbohydrates, and your fats, how they wind up affecting hormonal responses. So it's not the caloric intake, it's the hormonal response to those calories that really dictates, again, hormone insulin being the downstream player.
So if somebody came to you and said, what type of diet should I eat? What do you say?
I don't know that it's that simple. There's lots of different diets that work out there. The one that, and I hesitate using the word diet because that carries along with it a very negative connotation. Right. We teach nutrition. And so the nutritional platform that we teach is based on Primal. And the Primal blueprint, written by a guy named Mark Sisson, basically looks back and says, what were we eating before there was McDonald's on every corner? What did the hunter-gatherer societies do? How did they consume foods? And why was it that they didn't have the weight problems that we have today or the cancer problems that we have today and all the other health-related issues? And a lot of that stems back to the way that we've genetically modified foods. A lot of it is the incorrect, in my opinion, the incorrect belief that fats make you fat and fat gives you cardiovascular disease. And so what we've done is we've, by necessity, pushed people away from naturally occurring fats, animal fats and those types of things, and pushed them towards the industrialized processed fats, which we call polyunsaturated fatty acids. And so a lot of those can be a huge problem. But then even more than that, the government created the food pyramid. And what's at the bottom of that food pyramid? Grains. Grains are a big part of that. Well, what are grains? Grains are basically just carbohydrates. And the way that the body processes those is as soon as you ingest them, they're immediately converted to sugars. Right. And what do sugars do? They raise insulin levels.
And then insulin causes fat storage. Right?
It does, exactly.
Yeah. So it's actually the grains that are making us fatter more than the fats.
Yep. So certainly grains and pastas and cereals and those types of things, those are things that we aim to try to restrict or limit for people that are actively pursuing weight loss.
Right. Now, you mentioned the primal diet. How is that different from paleo?
There's subtle differences. A lot of them has to do with the incorporation of things like dairy, some of your oils and things like that. They are fairly similar. Right. Primal's a little bit more liberal. And we like that because we're trying to teach people something that they can do for life.
Yes.
That if you create an overly restrictive approach or an approach that people just simply don't like,
right.
they're never going to stick with it. So it has to be an approach that they can incorporate, enjoy, find variety in, and do for the rest of their life so that they're not cooking for themselves over here in one part of the kitchen and the rest of their family in the other part of the kitchen.
Right.
It has to be something the entire family can enjoy. And when you recognize that you're not putting the sole responsibility for your weight loss on the singular tool of nutrition, that it is an important part of it, but it's only one of many parts, then you can understand how I don't have to be as tightly controlled with my nutrition as maybe you thought previously.
Right, because food is an enjoyable substance, and we should be able to experience that, but also to live a healthy life. So it's finding that balance.
100%. When you start talking about bariatric procedures, I have specifically moved away from the gastric bypass. And the reason, one of the primary reasons, and there's multiple, but one of the primary reasons why we've moved away from that is because the way that procedure is done creates very, very unhealthy eating patterns. It makes a very, very small gastric pouch that doesn't allow people to eat. And that food goes directly from that pouch directly into the intestine, which can cause something called dumping syndrome and makes people feel horrible. Right. And those negative eating patterns can really drive a lot of other problems. If you start to look at the incidence of addictions, alcoholism and drug abuse and all these other things in the gastric bypass patient population, it's significantly higher than in the rest of the population. And a part of that is because you've taken away something that was designed for our enjoyment, which is food.
Yeah. Yeah. And doesn't the stomach have a role in hormones and regulation?
Absolutely it does. Probably not to the degree that we might have thought, but there are certainly many hormones that are produced in the stomach. Ghrelin is produced there, peptide YY, cholecystokinin, other hormones that wind up having further downstream effects that, again, ultimately result in either upregulation or downregulation of insulin. But yeah, that's where it all starts.
Right. So if you took away part of the stomach, some of that would be compromised.
Yeah, and even more than that, with the gastric bypass, you leave a defunctionalized stomach in place. And that defunctionalized stomach is recognizing that it's not being expanded normally, and so it's abnormally producing ghrelin, telling you, hey, I'm not getting what I need, eat. So these people can't eat, but they're being told all the time to eat through this hormone, and so it creates this very unhealthy cycle.
That sounds very uncomfortable. All right, well, let's hold that thought for a second. We'll come back to this. We're going to take a break to thank our sponsors. You're listening to Energize and Revitalize with Dr. Amy. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Energize and Revitalize with Dr. Amy. I'm Amy Coopersmith, and my guest today is Dr. Darren Peterson, the owner of Florida Coast Weight Loss. Before the break, we were talking about types of bariatric surgery, and you had mentioned what you don't do, but what kind of procedures do you perform?
So there are 4, maybe 5, depending on how you want to count, different procedures that are offered across the country today. The gastric bypass, as we talked about, is probably the gold standard that most of our understanding has been based upon with all the research over the course of 50 years. I have moved away from that one for some of the reasons that we talked about before. About 35 years ago, the lap band came out. And again, this was when our weight loss was based on the principle that it was about calories. And then what could I do to force somebody to take in fewer calories? And so the lap band was placed on the stomach basically as a restrictive device. About the same time that procedure was designed, the lap sleeve, or the sleeve gastrectomy was designed. And it was designed with essentially the same idea. Surgeons simply wanted to know, how can I make the size of the stomach smaller without having to put a foreign body that created some of its own issues associated with it? And by doing that, if I made the size of the stomach smaller, then I could force somebody to decrease their food intake. But something very interesting happened. They followed these patients for many, many years after initiating these procedures. And what they found was that the lap band, or the gastric band patients, just didn't do very well long term. Not only did a lot of them fail in the short term just because of the way that they felt, but over the long term, when you started looking at decades worth of data, the long-term outcomes were just absolutely dismal. And when they compared them to the sleeve, they recognized the sleeve patients were doing far better. And it's one of the things that caused multiple different groups of physicians to start looking scientifically into what are the differences and why does the sleeve work differently. And that's when we begin to discover that the sleeve really isn't simply about forcing somebody to eat less. Yes, portion control has a role to play, but what we discovered is the part of the stomach that goes away is responsible for producing many of the hormones that affects our weight physiologic set point. We haven't really talked about that much,
Yes.
but this is another aspect that hormones comes into play. And it's basically a concept that we came to describe what these hormones are doing for the layperson. When you're not trying to get into the complex cellular biology of how all these hormones work, the set point theory basically says that everyone has a genetically imprinted set point in the brain that's controlled and regulated by all these hormones. And that if you simply do things that forces your weight under that set point, but not moving the set point, then your body's constantly trying to restore that baseline. And so if you can do things to change the hormonal balance and actually move that set point to a lower set point, then your body can reassume a new baseline. And one of the things that we found is that certain surgical procedures, like the sleeve gastrectomy, actually has the ability to do that. By removing the outside portion of the stomach where hormones like ghrelin and peptide YY and cholecystokinin and others are produced, you can actually begin to modify some of the downstream hormonal responses that, again, changes that set point. So the sleeve gastrectomy is probably one of the most commonly performed procedures around the entire world. There's more than 300,000 procedures done annually. Now with the advent of GLP medications, that has changed, but I think we're already starting to see that pendulum coming back, because those medicines are not for everybody. They have their role, but they're certainly not for the majority of people that are currently using them. And so the sleeve gastrectomy can play a very important role. I use them for patients that either have no diabetes or well-controlled diabetes and have somewhere around 100 pounds or less that they want to lose. Once you start surpassing 100 pounds, or if you start throwing diabetes in the mix, especially long-standing diabetes or people that have hemoglobin A1Cs that are very high in the 10, 12, 14 kind of range, that procedure oftentimes is inadequate to helping them reach their goals. So we now have pulled a procedure that's actually older than the gastric bypass. We pulled it off the shelf, dusted it off, and changed the way that we did it a little bit based on a lot of our understanding of the gastric bypass. It's a procedure called the duodenal switch. And that procedure is a two-step procedure, starting with the sleeve gastrectomy, but then it also unplugs the stomach from the first portion of the small bowel and plugs it back in about halfway down. So it changes where food enters the small bowel. We don't remove or rearrange any intestine. We simply change where food enters. And what we've discovered is that causes additional hormonal changes that causes that set point to drop yet again. And we can prove how metabolically active it is by the incidence of resolution of diabetes. I see literally
amazing.
It is incredible.
Life-changing.
100%. We see upwards of 95% of our patients completely cured of their diabetes. In fact, so active that I will literally send patients home from the operating room off their diabetic medicines oftentimes.
Yeah, that's really, really fantastic. So you mentioned surgery is a tool that a person can use. Medications are a tool. Diet is a tool. So how can people take these tools to become more successful?
So just as you said, it really takes recognizing that it has to be this comprehensive approach. We were talking at the break that many people will wind up failing because they simply grab this hammer or that hammer and think that it's going to do all the work. But our bodies are too intelligent for that. Our biologic systems are incredibly complex. And if you wind up affecting hormonal pathways through one mechanism alone, the body figures a workaround. And so you really have to control these hormonal pathways. The only way that you're going to decrease that physiologic set point is by having a more comprehensive approach and recognizing that all these things are important, that you can't ignore any of them. You can't ignore your sleep issues. You can't ignore your stress issues or the fact that you don't exercise or not active at all. And so all of these things can be important. It's about filling your toolbox with the tools that are appropriate for you. Not everybody needs all the tools. Not everybody needs surgery. Surgery can be a very important, powerful tool, but it's individualized as to what does this person need to fill their toolbox with.
Right. Now, you just mentioned exercise. That's something we haven't talked about yet here, but where does exercise play a role in someone's weight loss journey?
So there's really two things that we talk about when it comes to exercise. The old mentality that exercise is purely that calorie out aspect is really incorrect. Do you burn calories when you exercise? Yes, of course you do. But is that the primary reason why we want them to do that? No, it's actually not. There's two reasons why we do it. Number one is because when you exercise, you induce the release of hormones. And this is where it gets back to the hormonal model of weight loss. And that hormonal release optimizes organ system function that helps support, sustain weight loss that's achieved through other mechanisms as well. But beyond that, we really look at your weight loss journey as under the umbrella of health and wellness. That when you're really pursuing a life of health and wellness, that's when you achieve the sustainable weight loss that you're looking for. And so in that realm, exercise is also about functionality. How do we help return people back to the state where they can live their life and do the things that they enjoy? And as we get older and older, preventing injuries, which can be a major source of problems as we age.
I think even for people who are at a norm or healthy weight, exercise is vital for healthy aging in terms of, like you said, injury prevention, being able to do the things we want to do.
There's some interesting studies looking at lean muscle mass and how the preservation of lean mass actually significantly increases longevity. And we all lose muscle as we age. And so doing things to try to stabilize that and prevent that with resistance training, with nutritional things, even with supplements like creatine and some other things that help to preserve that muscle mass can be very important.
Yeah, I think some criticism that some weight loss practices haven't encountered is that people can lose their lean muscle and their pounds may be going down, but a lot of what they're losing is muscle. And then what happens when they gain weight?
They don't, when they regain weight, they're not gaining muscle, they're gaining fat. So you've created even a worse problem. Right. It's one of my major issues with the GLP medications that are out there now. If you look at the studies and you follow people and how they're losing weight, one of the major problems is, number one, they're not being educated appropriately to how to use these medications. And number two, they're not being followed properly. They're just following their weight loss. Well, the scale is a very inaccurate monitor of our weight loss, that you really need body composition scans to understand where that weight loss is coming from in order to stabilize muscle loss. And there's ways that you can do that while on those medicines. But in general, if you look at the data, upwards of 60% of a patient's weight loss on GLP medications is coming from muscle. And that's a horrible way, as you just said, a horrible way of losing weight.
So one thing we're very careful about is when we bring people in is we really do our best to educate people on you've got to, people just don't like to exercise. Like, but you have to, because if you don't, you're going to end up more metabolically unhealthy in the long run. So it's just something that we have to get past in order to stay healthy.
Completely agree. And the problem is that I think people, especially people that are not in the habit of exercising regularly, have this incorrect assessment that you have to go to the gym and you have to spend 3 hours a day pumping iron. No, you don't. There's lots and lots of different ways of achieving all that without having to necessarily go to a gym. If you're the gym type, fantastic. We can show you ways of accomplishing that. But if you're one that doesn't like going to the gym, there's still ways that you can live a healthy, active lifestyle and create that state where you're maintaining muscle mass without having to necessarily go to the gym all the time.
Yep. Now, you wrote a book called The Life Change. I don't know if we can see that. It's available on Amazon. So you have a very detailed description of the hormones that we talked about. But in the early chapters, you talk about shame and how obesity is associated with shame. So what did you mean by that?
You know, again, I think there's multiple reasons why people have struggled with their weight over time. And what we've done, because we've reduced weight loss to the very simplistic calorie in, calorie out, we put all the onus of responsibility on the patient's head. and basically said, if you're not losing weight, it's your fault.
Right.
That you should be able to control what you consume. And if you're not losing weight, then you're just not controlling it appropriately.
Push away from the table.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so we've created all these cliches and we've shamed people into thinking, well, I'm obese or I'm struggling losing weight and it's my fault. Do people play a role, and do they have a role to play in being responsible for their weight? Yes. But again, when it falls back on this very simplistic, it's all about calories, it becomes very easy for people to put that responsibility on their shoulders in an incorrect way that develops that guilt and shame cycle.
Yep. There's so much emotion involved. And when people come to us for help in the journey, and there's so much anger or even anger at themselves.
100%.
That it's, as a practitioner, it's one of the biggest challenges in trying to help people, because we can show them, we can tell them, but it's about believing that they're good and valid people, that we have to help them to understand that.
I couldn't agree more. And it's one of the reasons why we spend so much time trying to get people to break away from the calorie in, calorie out mindset, because that does put it right back on that you and you alone are solely responsible for that. And again, yes, the individual does play a role in all of this, but I think when they begin to understand that physiology is a lot more complicated than that, and that there's many other things that they may not have understood that are driving their weight issues, that can help remove a lot of that guilt and shame.
Yes. Well, we're just about out of time. How can our listeners find out more about you?
Well, so we've got the book that you just described. We titled it Life Change, because it's really not about losing weight. It's really about changing people's lives.
Yes.
And that's what we're really in the business of. We have a website. It's just www.floridacoastweightloss.com.
Yep.
And we've got lots of information on that.
And we'll link that on our site too.
Perfect.
Thank you so much for being on our show.
Enjoyed it.
And thank you to the listeners for tuning in to Energize and Revitalize with Dr. Amy. I'll be back next Saturday morning at 7:30 with more expert insights and practical strategies to help you live your healthiest and most energized life. Until then, stay healthy, and here's to your best life.